Now let's try to perform that multi-database setup with another package, spatie multi-tenancy. And I will remind you it has fewer features. Its philosophy is to provide the bare bones for the multi-tenancy, but not more than that. So we install it fresh, installation, then publishing the config, and next step, single database or multiple database. Let's click multiple database and let's see the setup here. Configuring the database connections. This will be a bit different from the previous package, how to configure database connections. You will need two connections, landlord and tenant. If we take a look at config multi-tenancy PHP, the database connection names are null, tenant and landlord. So for that we define MySQL as landlord, the connection name in .env file, or in fact in config database. Here's our main tenancy database, and then we will copy and paste that MySQL and then name that tenant, and that tenant should be database null, so database null. Everything else could be the same. In the config multi-tenancy we have tenant here. And if we scroll down the documentation, this is exactly what is needed. So landlord database is set and tenant database is null because it's dynamic. Next, in the documentation, migrating the landlord database. They call it landlord or main database. We need to publish the migrations of that landlord. And as you can see, they are in database migrations landlord subfolder. So the other way around from a previous package. Previous package provided the tenant subfolder, and in this case landlord is a subfolder. And the documentation says that all the new migrations should be in database migrations landlord, and let's actually move the current migrations. So we have database migrations, all of those, and then landlord. So let's move everything to landlord and we will remigrate fresh our database, refactor, and here we'll have tenants on the landlord database, but projects and tasks actually should be in the main migrations folder, refactor. Now let's create the pivot table for tenant user, so PHP artisan make migration, and we will do it on the landlord. So create tenant user table, path, database, migrations, landlord, like this. And we have that new migration in the subfolder with foreign IDs to tenant ID, constrained, and user ID, constrained, without timestamps. Okay, and let's migrate the landlord database. Our database isn't landlord, it's default MySQL connection, but we need to migrate those from the path. The database is empty currently, and we have successful migrations, but we don't have projects and tasks. And for that, we will migrate the tenant database while creating the tenant. So behind the scenes, I've done the usual stuff of registration form for subdomain, then registered users controller. We have creation of the user and then this thing. So we're creating the tenant, we're providing the database name, which would be the same as subdomain, for example. At least we will experiment for now. And then redirect to the subdomain. And also in the user model, tenants belongs to many. Nothing really new here, right? And now if we register, let's see what happens. We'll register with a new domain, ABCD. We are redirected correctly to the domain, but if we click tasks, it says tenancy tasks doesn't exist, so it doesn't switch to the tenant database automatically. In the database, in our landlord database, we have the user's tenant user, we have the tenant, and we have the database name ABCD. And if we try to open the database with that name, it wasn't created. So spatie package leaves that for us to create the database, and then it would automatically switch to the database. If we go back to the documentation, we need to first make the tenant current, and for that we have tenant make current. This is the method which comes from tenant model that extends the tenant model from spatie, the main method make current. And then the documentation says that on make current switch tenant task, we have switch tenant database task. And we need to enable that in the config of multi-tenancy. If we go up, switch tenant task, we need to change the database, switch tenant database task. If we click here, Inside we have set tenant connection database name, so it switches the database as soon as we switch the tenant. What about creating the database? The package says creating tenant databases. Basically, it says that it's our job to create the database however we want. And then down below, migrating tenant database, we have artisan command, but we don't have any automatic migration, which was surprising to me actually. Compare that to previous package of Stencil Architect X tenancy. That package does that for us, and in here with spatie we need to do that ourselves, also launching automatically artisan command. But oh well, let's do that. And one of the ways to do that, one of the places the package recommends when a tenant model gets created. So we go into that section of the documentation, and this is the example code that could happen. So custom tenant model, we have our model here. So in here, in the booted method, as it is suggested, we will create the database and migrate that. So I copy protected static booted, but just instead of this, so tenant, we will have a full function, not the short function, and we will have two things. I will copy and paste it from my notes. So create database if not exist, tenant database name, and we load DB with facade. We just execute SQL statement. I guess we need to also provide the prefix, so let's do tenancy underscore tenant database here. And also we need to migrate the database, but first we need to switch to the database, and this is tricky. I've spent quite a lot of time in the background to figure this out. If I launch the migration here in the creating, by this time the database isn't actually switched. So we need to create the model, create the database. Then in the multi-tenancy, switch tenant tasks will happen, which will switch to the database. And then after the method was created, we need to run migrations. So for that, we will duplicate that static created to static created. Created. You can use model observer for that if you wish. So on created, again, I will copy that from my notes. We will launch tenant artisan migrate. Artisan should be from facade, and also one more thing, tenant here and tenant here. So this is what should happen on creating of new model of tenant. And also finally, for all the models, we need to specify which models work with tenant or with landlord. If we scroll down, preparing models, you need to use landlord connection or tenant connection. What do we have in models? We have 4 models, so project will be uses tenant connection, task will be uses tenant connection, but tenant will be by default landlord, we don't need to specify that, and user will be for uses landlord connection. And let's try it out now. So we register fake filler subdomain XYZ, for example, we register, and we have unknown database. Oh, because I've added prefix here, and in this case that command is running through all the database names. So if we refresh the tenants, the database is XYZ and not tenancy XYZ. So let's remove that tenancy underscore from here from the model, and let's put that instead in the registered users controller, so the database would be prefix tenancy underscore request subdomain. And also I remember 2 things that we haven't done is the tenant middleware for protecting the subdomains. So there's route group tenant with those 2 validation middlewares that are provided from the documentation. And also what I didn't do is in the config, I didn't specify the tenant finder, which would be subdomain tenant finder or domain tenant finder class. And now let's try it all out. So we register fake filler subdomain, for example, HHH or something. We register, the subdomain is correct, and then the tasks empty, projects empty, and those come from the database, from separate tenant database. So this is our database. I've been doing a lot of testing behind the scenes, so this is the latest one. And if we search the databases for HHH, this is the one which has projects and tasks separately. So if we add a project 1, 2, 3, 4, it is saved here in this database, as well as the task. We add the task to the project and it is saved in this database. So we have performed and finished the multi-database setup with this spatie package. registration, creating the tenant, separating the connections, and redirecting where it needs to be redirected.